Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the story of beer, climate, and advocacy. It's co-hosted today by business climate leaders and the Grasstops Outreach Action Teams. I'm Randy Salem from the Business Climate Leaders, and it's my pleasure to introduce Steffi Rausch. Steffi is my compatriot and partner in crime on the Brew team. She is the group leader of Asheville, North Carolina CCL chapter, as well as the co-lead of the Grasstops Outreach Action Team. So Steffi.
Hi everyone, so nice to see lots of people here on the call today. I just want to raise my stein to our guest speaker here, but first I want to cover a little bit about our U.S. Brewers and carbon pricing and climate action declaration. So basically we have now almost 40 endorsements. We're trying to obtain 99 bottlers of beer for our cause by June when we lobby in DC. So as you can see the breakout for the states on the slide there, we have almost 100 CCL and BCLers working on these endorsements across the country, and would love to have some more join us in this effort, and even join in with a beer, you know, every so often. There is a website, of course, that they can go to, businessclimateleaders.org, for that. That is where they would endorse online. We also are creating a paper copy that you can bring with you if you'd like, and there's a toolkit for people to use to get these endorsements. So let's start out with introductions for Andy Tveekrem. So Andy, first of all, is a master brewer and co-founder of Market Garden Breweries, which include Market Garden Brewery, a brew pub, Nano Brew Cleveland, which is a brew pub and pilot brewery, and Market Garden Craft Brewery, production brewery. He's been working on these various endeavors since 2010. For the 2 decades prior to this, he has been a brewmaster at Dogfish Head Craft Brewery in Milton, Delaware, Frederick Brewing Company in Maryland, and Great Lakes Brewing Company in Cleveland. Andy is also active in the Master Brewers Association. He served as the National Technical Committee Chair over the past 4 years, being part of the Structural Review Working Group, as well as representing District Midwest on the Board of Governors. So he has a wealth of knowledge in this realm, and so yeah, let's get started. So Andy, first of all, I know the first time we talked, you had the most detailed stories I've heard about how climate is impacting brewers. Could you elaborate on some of those stories?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Happy to talk about, the issues that we confront. Some interesting things. I mean, we all kind of, as brewers, are aware of the impacts of our various raw materials and how sensitive they are to shifts in the climate, especially around the harvest time. But one of the more dramatic ones I thought came up recently out of Europe, where they've been experiencing a bit of a drought, actually quite a bit of a drought over the last several years, especially in Northwestern Europe, so France, Germany, the Low Countries. And so drought, obviously, if you're trying to grow barley, that's a problem. It leads to a poor harvest. It leads to things like high protein levels, which brewers don't like because it's not good for the beer. And so that we understood. But the interesting thing for me was that the drought also dropped the levels of water in rivers and canals. And that made it very difficult to transport the barley to the maltsters, and for the maltsters to get that barley out to their customers, either via ports to go out to the sea, or inland through various transportation networks. So you have this kind of double whammy of poorer quality harvest, and then the inability to transport it economically. So then you have to look at land transportation, either rail or truck, which dramatically can drive up the costs. And so this is kind of this really, really nasty scenario, and obviously not a good thing for the brewer who's trying to get high quality malt on a daily basis. Another one I experienced, I went out to the hop harvest in the Yakima Valley of Washington last year. And if you remember last year, not this fall, but the previous fall, the entire area was just wildfires galore. And so this valley where all the hops were growing, I go in there and it's just this brown haze. And I said, what's going on? And they said, well, we have 6 major wildfires within several hundred miles of us. And it's just the way it's been for the last month. And it's until they burn out and go away, it's just going to be like this. And it didn't really impact the hops themselves, but it sure impacted me because I came away thinking, wow, I feel like I've smoked 3 packs of cigarettes every night that I've been here. You wake up in the morning, you're just wheezing. And I just can't imagine how it would be to have to work through that entire harvest cycle, or for the people living there, frankly, just, day to day, the problems they would have. And I did talk to a brewer down in Northern California, and they were having the same problem, especially this year with the campfire and those other fires that were going on. And, they had to pass out respirators, and get air filters so their employees could actually just come to work and not, pass out from all the fumes. It was pretty nasty. And these, I think, are things that are pretty directly related to climate change. Another instance is I work here in Ohio, and we have a researcher at Ohio State University, and he's in a 10-year program to select new barley varieties for winter hardiness. So you want to plant the barley in the winter, have it overwintered in the ground, and you harvest it in the spring. And so it's a kind of a cycle that would work here in Ohio. And then farmers could harvest it and then go into corn or soybean or whatever. Back when the 2014, 2015 polar vortex event happened, we had, really low temperatures for several weeks at a time. And basically all of his seed test plots just died. So I guess you could look at it as a really good stress test for winter hardiness, but when you're in the middle of a program that takes 10 years to select new varieties, that's kind of a big setback halfway through. You have to go back and almost start over again. So that's the life cycle, to come up with new hops or new barley varieties. It is about a decade to get these things to come to the market. You start with thousands, 10,000 different, plants that you've kind of worked out, and then you just keep kicking them out until you get 1 or 2 that actually are going to be acceptable across the board. So the more variability you have on the front end, the more variability you're going to have trying to adapt.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Andy. So given that they grow most of the hops out in the Northwest, and that's pretty prominent for fires and drought. I think the barley's moving more north towards Canada, but given these changes in climate, how do you feel that they're affecting the hop and barley supplies? Are the farmers or brewers adapting to these, and are the brewers seeing an increase in the cost because of this?
Sure. So there is concentrated areas of production for both hops and for malt and barley growing, and then, which then leads to malt production. But it is still a very much a global commodity. So you've got areas in Germany that are almost as big in terms of the hop growing as we are here in the Yakima Valley. You've also got New Zealand, which has a really good hop growing region, and in various other parts of the world. Same with barley. It's pretty spread out. It's a very hardy, adaptable plant. So that mitigates some of the effects. So I would call it the whipsaw effects that can happen, because if there's a poor harvest here, you can go over there and get some. But every time that happens, prices go up. There's more pressure on the suppliers to provide, those commodities. And these are typically contracted out in advance, several years in advance. So, in the worst case scenario, if you have a major crop failure, you could see, contracts being nullified or disregarded, and that would be a really bad situation. We saw some of that back in 2007, 2008 with the malt crop, when there was a big failure over in Australia due to drought, again, about a 10-year drought. So it put a lot of pressure on the brewers in Southeast Asia, and they started coming over and buying up a lot of the North American malting supply. And, when they come in with suitcases full of cash, that contract can go out the window. So that's kind of the economic reality. It's going to be a struggle to meet supply and demand as time goes on.
And I understand that America used to provide a third of the hops around the world, and now we are providing almost a half because of the issues that other countries have had in mitigation efforts and whatnot, right?
Sure, yeah. So the Hallertau and the other hop growing regions in Germany used to be slightly more than half. They've percentage-wise declined a bit as we have ramped up our production, but the big difference is in our growing regions, which are fairly arid and governed by water from snow melt up in the mountains, we irrigate. So you can water the crop through the summer when it's really dry. In Europe, they tend not to irrigate. They don't have that infrastructure, and there's a lot of issues with water rights. Are you even allowed to pump water out of the ground? So that's been the big difference. And also the hop market in the United States has responded to craft brewers. We have a huge thirst for hop varieties, and we use them in much greater proportions than the traditional brewers do.
And did you say that the cost hasn't been too affected because they've had like a backlog of supplies? So the costs have not really gone up too much, but they probably will over time. Is that right?
Yeah, the cost of supply kind of works with the demand, but sometimes there's spikes up and down based on basically how the harvest came in. But overall, it's been fairly reasonable. But I can't say that that's going to continue. I mean, for barley, most of the maltsters have one or at least one, probably two, sometimes 3 years of a backlog of the barley in storage. So, if there's a bad harvest in 2019, well, they're still working through the 2016 crop. So that helps.
Okay. And then as the climate impacts get worse over time, do you feel that the brewers will start, possibly the Brewers Association, the BA, will need to speak up and support federal legislation to ensure the industry's future as things get worse? I mean, we can only mitigate so long before we have to start passing some federal big changes. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I can't truly speak for the Brewers Association. It's its own entity, but as a craft brewer, it's very apparent to me that certain things do need to happen, and so lobbying for change at the national level is one of those things. Getting the brewers, most brewers that I know are concerned about this problem of climate change, but getting them to land on one kind of key solution as opposed to a myriad of solutions, that's been the challenge of getting some agreement. But it's getting more and more apparent. I think we can all see that the political winds have kind of shifted since the 2016 election. A lot more people are thinking about this and talking about this than before. And so that's a good thing. The question is, can we turn it into reality? Can we get something done?
So currently you're saying that the BA and brewers don't really have any specific policy that they're wanting to see passed locally or nationally. They're just sort of waiting to see what comes about. Is that correct?
Yeah, and then honestly, in a discussion I had, one of the problems they felt was with the current.
Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay, great. So we have about, I'd say 5 more minutes before we turn to questions. So let's talk about, say, the ag ingredients. Do you measure and influence the emissions associated with growing, processing, or transporting these products to your breweries? And do you encourage or require your suppliers to mitigate those emissions?
Currently, at least from small brewers, we don't really ask too much about how they're doing what they're doing. We're concerned mostly with the quality of what comes out. But I think it's important to note that, craft brewers are little bitty breweries, and some of the suppliers are really big multinational companies. They are very much focused on their bottom line. And so they have a lot of energy costs associated with malting barley and drying it, or harvesting hops and drying them. So they're pretty keenly aware of their cost structure and trying to be as energy efficient as possible. So we kind of leave it to them to do. The larger breweries might be a little ahead of the curve on it. as far as that goes, they have a little more clout. You know, when you're Anheuser-Busch and you make 100 million barrels of beer a year, and my brewery makes 6,000, there's a little bit of a difference. But yeah, I mean, we're definitely talking to them, and we want them to be as, you know, ecologically sustainable as possible.
And what's your main concerns legislatively for brewers? What are the main concerns legislatively for brewers at the moment? And will climate eventually be one of them? I know the BA has some certain concerns right now that they're working on this year.
Right. So yeah, there was a tax cut package for small brewers that was passed 2 years ago, and that expires this year. So if we can't get it renewed, then we go back to the old tax rate. So that's been a big focus, and just trying to make sure that, you know, we don't upset the apple cart too much by pushing for other things. So hopefully, if we're successful and we can get that passed, this tax cut renewed and granted into perpetuity, then we start thinking about some bigger, more wide scope ideas.
Wonderful. Yeah, and definitely has helped grow the craft brewery movement nationwide. Like you said, it's now what, in how many thousands now? And it used to be only like 100 or so craft brewers across the nation.
Right. Yeah. Back in the early 1980s, there were 80 brewing companies in the United States. Now, I think by the end of this year, we'll be closer to 8,000. So a lot of growth in about 30 years or 40 years. But, you know, a lot of that growth is in very small breweries. And so they're struggling to just attain profitability. And, you know, there's an old saying that profitability drives sustainability, because you can't make huge investments into eco-friendly ideas and things if you're not in the black. It's just, you know, kind of common business sense.
So this tax credit does mean a lot to the craft brewers.
It does. It does.
Okay, and so what's your view on the need for an effectiveness of carbon pricing on breweries? Basically, why do you feel that the carbon dividend approach is the best policy, and why did you support the Energy Innovation Act?
For me, it's just, I want to do something, you know, and this seemed like the most logical approach of all the ones that I've heard, mostly because of the way the dividend is kicked back directly to the consumer, the people that are, you know, the citizens of the United States, as opposed to having, say, the government collect a bunch of money and then do Lord knows what with it. It's kind of a mistrust there, I think, for a lot of people. This would hopefully circumvent that and just, you know, get the money directly back. And that makes a lot of sense.
And I know myself, when I have more money back in my pockets, I actually go out and go out to the breweries. I have a good time with friends. Whereas if I don't have enough money in my pockets, I stay home. So the Remy Report does show this to bear in some of the graphs. The beverage and tobacco industry is, I believe, third on one of the manufacturing graphs in the Remy Report. That's listed in our toolkit. So it's something that you can definitely pass along to other brewers when you talk with them, that this would help benefit their bottom line.
Right.
And also the farmer provisions, right? For hop and barley farmers. You probably like that as well, correct?
Yeah, I think they get a credit for the diesel fuel that they use, which is the agricultural fuel, not on the road stuff.
To help offset that rising cost. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, and what do you think is the most effective approach with brewers and getting them to step out of their comfort zones and advocate for climate policy?
I think just bringing it up and talking about it is a key, you know, and also I think it might help if we had a more definitive kind of case study of an actual brewery, you know, what their cost structure would look like going forward as these you know, these carbon fees were assessed, because that's the one thing I get, you know, people coming to me and saying, well, what's that do to the bottom line? And so if you can kind of say, well, here, look at this kind of details how all of our costs would be adjusted, that could help a lot.
And there has been, I've seen some reports on the carbon footprint of like a certain pale ale from, I think, New Belgium, for example. And we have a guy that actually created that report that I have referred to some brewers in my area when they have questioned what the cost would be to them and how they could, you know, assess what those fees would be. So there are, I think, growing resources for that. So let's open it up to questions at this point. Randy, you want to go ahead and do that?
Yes. Hello. Thank you, Andy and Steffi. A couple of questions that have come up. One is making beer makes CO2. So how do you deal with that? Is there anything you do in terms of that in your process?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it comes back to what I alluded to earlier. When you're growing barley to make beer, the amount of barley you're planting to make that beer is about a 5-to-1 offset over the CO2 that you're going to produce by fermentation. And also, CO2 is going to come out somewhere. I mean, it's just kind of the life cycle of nature. It's released, it's reabsorbed, it turns into oxygen, and then it gets, just goes round and round. So I don't think we're necessarily net negative. I think there's more concern about just the transportation costs and the distribution, putting it in cans and bottles. You've got to mine aluminum, you've got to melt glass. Those are a lot more energy intensive than the CO2 that we emit.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned profitability. Profitability drives sustainability. And thus, I would imagine there's concern, in talking with brewers and every business in terms of, what would the impact be on their cost structure of, having a carbon fee, for instance. That's one aspect of that, and how that's going to relate to their profitability and whether they would get involved in policy. Another piece is in terms of, where their customers are going to how the customers are going to feel about getting involved in a political or supporting climate and what those issues are.
Yeah, that's obviously a big concern in any consumer products company, which is certainly what beer is. You don't want to just say we're only looking to make our beer for this customer over here and ignore all the ones over there that may feel differently. So we have to kind of do a balancing act there. But I think there's pretty good consensus about climate change being a real issue, despite some of the political attempts to make it not an issue. There's just enough evidence going on right now that we can move forward.
Great. And do you see a difference between the big producers, the Budweisers, et cetera, the large producers, and the small craft producers? I guess in terms of sustainability, but also in terms of their willingness to get involved in political advocacy for climate.
Yeah, so the big brewers are probably actually far ahead of the small brewers as far as their concern about their supply chain and the long-term effects of climate change and how it could impact their businesses. That's driven by the fact that they're oftentimes generations into this game, 5-6 generations of a family, whereas most craft brewers are fairly young, new companies. That doesn't mean we don't care. It's just a difference of kind of the scope of vision. The other side, though, is are they advocating? That is a tough one. I can't really speak for any particular company, but they probably have the same concern that I mentioned earlier. Is like, what's the public perception? When the public perception maybe shifts to like, if you're not doing something, people are going to view it negatively, then definitely more people are going to get on board. So it's kind of almost has to come from the bottom up.
I just want to reiterate that if you have a question, you can enter it into the chat. We're preferring to take questions that way. So at the bottom of your screen, there should be a chat icon you can click and then type in your question.
And Andy, can you talk a little bit about any sustainability policies or practices that you're doing at Market Garden? Anything you want to highlight?
We're working right now on just reducing our water usage. So every brewer has a metric of how many gallons or barrels of water it takes to produce a gallon or a barrel of beer. And, the closer that ratio is, like world class would be maybe 3 barrels of water to 1 barrel of beer. And we, my little brewery is quite a bit higher than that. So our goal is to basically, we're putting in flow meters and the ability to monitor key locations around the brewery and just, really start looking at it and reducing it. It takes a little bit of money to spend. You got to buy the meters and put them in. But more importantly, for us, it'll help us on our bottom line once we use less water.
Anything else that you can say in terms of the people on the call are working to, kind of to get in the door with brewers and talk about climate? Is there anything that you can, I guess, words of encouragement or ideas in terms of how to get your foot in that door?
Well, I would say, if you're visiting your local brewery, your brew pub, or a tap room, just strike up a conversation and ask them, what is your stance? Are you doing anything concrete? Have you discussed it? The more people are going to talk about it, we're very receptive to the public because we have, we interact a lot with the public. Like we have bars and restaurants. So for us, that's a very important thing. And the more we hear bubbling up from the ground level, the more we're going to be inclined to do something about it.
Great. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Last question, Steph, for you, or?
I see someone has asked here, what are the brewers' biggest concerns regarding cost with a carbon fee? And I definitely have seen with certain brewers, or one in particular, they are more concerned about the cost of the rising fee to their business bottom line versus what we try to focus on is, of course, the dividend and the fact that they can pass along those costs. And most businesses will. And the cost of inaction is vastly greater than the cost of action. Those are points I make very clear, but they definitely, some of them will be stuck on what is the cost to their business. Before they make a decision, they want to be able to evaluate those costs, and that requires, I guess, an accountant or an economist. What would you say, Andy, to that as well? Do you have any additional things you would want to say?
Sure. So that is a concern, a very legitimate concern. Anybody running a business and you say, well, we want to, do this fee. Okay, how does that impact my business? And the real concern, I think, is what are the multiplication effects? So if there's a fee imposed on carbon at the source, now there's a, that has to, whatever that, say it's natural gas, that has to go through a transmission system, so pipelines or something like that. That adds another layer of cost. So the higher the cost is up front, then those things just kind of keep multiplying. And then we have to raise our prices and to try and accommodate it. And then our distributor has to raise their price because they're transporting the beer around. So, it just kind of is this, it's hard to nail down. That's where I think, a good case study would help a lot. We could kind of identify what those costs would look like.
All right. Well, thank you very, very much. So if anybody's in Cleveland, definitely look up Andy and treat him to a beer. So really appreciate you being with us, Andy. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And in closing, I just want to pop up here our the email for the brew team. So if you are not a member of CCL, BCL brew team, do send us an email at brewteam@citizensclimate.org and check out businessclimateleaders.org if you want to see what BCL is up to, as well as the Grasstops Outreach Action Team on community. So with that, thank you everybody for being here. Very much appreciate Andy and everybody. So thanks and good night.
Cheers to you, Andy. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.